Let's go back to Brent. He's got some new guests to talk about where we are this evening.
That's right. Well, we certainly are not where we thought we were going to be, even if you had talked with us an hour ago, Sarah. Yes, we've got new guests at the table with us right now. To my right is Ellen Schulz. She is with the Robert Bosch Foundation, and right next to her is David Keating. He is an American broadcast journalist based in Brussels and Berlin. He's done a lot of analysis for us here at DW as well. It's good to have both of you here at the big table with us. But this is going to be a completely different United States that its allies are going to have to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, in the same way there's going to be huge uncertainty globally, there's going to be huge uncertainty domestically if he wins. And again, of course, it's early. But it's hard to know what world we're going to wake up to tomorrow. If you think about domestically in the U.S., I mean, this is a candidate who may be about to become president, who almost the entirety of the establishment, media, political, journalism, all opposed. If you look at the late-night comedy shows, I mean, the level to which it was quite unprecedented that the late-night comedy hosts went out of their way to really talk about Trump in very extreme terms. How do they then go on hosting a comedy show for the rest of the week? How do newspapers that came out against him in the strongest terms possible, how do they work with a president like that? It's actually hard to picture.
Here you've got rural voters feel so alienated from the city folks, and as just one of the many different divides, and the fear of the changing complexion of American society, the fear of other languages coming into American society, that all of these things come together as a coalition that we're not used to. We're used to thinking of coalitions sort of demographically defined.
We are just hearing that NBC is calling Ohio for Trump. That is has just come across. Also, we're getting something from North Carolina. The Republican Richard Burr of North Carolina has been reelected to the Senate. So that is a Republican that is solidifying North Carolina's place as a red state there, too. Trump projected winner, I'll say that one more time, in Ohio, 18 electoral college votes. They are going to him. NBC is predicting that. So, all right, we're moving on further west. It's not getting better for Hillary Clinton. Let's assume she loses. What can happen then to address what Irwin's talking about, this disconnect in American society?
I think what's interesting is that, I mean, it may be there was this fear about the silent Trump voter ahead of the election, that some people who were being called by pollsters, if they have a feeling of, the elites are against me, or they may not trust a pollster to tell them that they were intending on voting for Trump. And I think this is a phenomenon that is somehow going to have to be addressed, that people have a real distrust of institutions. And I think perhaps it may be even extended into a distrust of people calling for polls because they saw those people as coming from.
That's right.
Like the Brady effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, people dislike that tremendously. The whole telemarketing effect in the United States, too. I mean, that certainly cannot be over-exaggerated either in how people, they simply hate having their homes invaded by this. Any idea on what this, what the U.S. could look like in terms of trying to address what Irwin was talking about?
So I think one of the biggest overarching questions, certainly of this whole election, is really how to rebuild a social trust that's quite frankly been lost. And this both includes social trust in institutions, social trust in parties, social trust in Congress. And at the end of the day, you are going to have approximately half the country that's going to be essentially required to accept a candidate that not only did they not vote for, but that they also don't like and don't trust. And that's not necessarily a tenable way for either candidate to govern for the next 4 or potentially 8 years, especially if you're also talking about a divided House and Senate.
That's right.
So I think one of the biggest issues has got to be how does the winner, regardless of who that winner might be, actually reach out to, develop relationships with, and connect with the voting group that actually voted for the other candidate.
Yeah, that's right. And we were saying earlier tonight, if Hillary Clinton were to win, would she, reach out to the Trump camp and not basically, rub it in their face that they had lost? Will we see, the reverse of that with the Trump victory?
I think you'll probably see it from congressional Republicans. I'm not sure you'll see it from Trump. I think you'll see it from Mike Pence, his vice president,
Right.
and his role. That's a big question mark. I mean, there are a lot of people who have theorized that Donald Trump doesn't have a lot of interest in actually governing. He's going to hand over things to
Mike Pence.
To Mike Pence. There was the, rumors that in some of his other vice presidential discussions, that's the way it was framed, that the vice president would be kind of running things. And,
As the shadow president.
exactly, yeah. So, and Mike Pence may be more conciliatory than Trump himself.
All right. Well, Donald Trump has always been a divisive figure. For some, he's a straight talker who will bring desperately needed change to Washington and who will stand up for ordinary Americans. Now, to others, he's a dangerous demagogue who has no respect for minorities and has the wrong temperament to lead the country. Let's take a look back at a presidential campaign that has defied conventional wisdom. Would he even want to have the responsibility and the role that a president has? I mean, we were talking earlier that maybe that's why Pence is the vice presidential candidate.
I think a lot of foreign leaders might be hoping that that's the scenario. I think this morning they know relatively little about Pence as well,
Right.
but he at least appears like a stable hand, at least in the international realm. I think domestically, a presidency where Mike Pence had a lot of power would look like a very different policy situation domestically than under an Obama administration. Internationally, maybe not so different, and perhaps that's what foreign leaders are hoping for.
It's interesting when we hear Irwin say that there may have been a calculus that was just not included or a variable that was left out. In concrete terms, it means that there's something about American society that just is not being registered. And do you guys want to take a stab at what that could be? Is it the angry white voter that we've heard so much about? Is that what we're forgetting?
I think to a certain extent, Trump has hit on one trend that does point to why there is this disconnect, which is the kind of establishment, non-establishment, or if you will, anti-establishment sentiment. Washington, to a certain extent, is a bubble. I think that's a fair criticism that the longer you stay in Washington, perhaps the less in touch you are with, say, the populace outside of the bubble. That said, this obviously goes beyond anti-establishment or establishment politics. This, I think, is the culmination of a lot of different trends that just happen to intersect at one moment, from sort of the angry white voter, so to speak, to the establishment issues, to, the confluence of happening against a candidate who just wasn't that well liked and didn't inspire the same kind of, quite frankly, enthusiasm amongst her supporters.
So a perfect storm is what you're describing.
Perhaps.
I think the other lesson to be drawn as well is that the arguments, just like in the case with Brexit, the arguments about stability, about if you vote this way, you will cause instability, markets will tank, you will possibly cause a military conflict with Mexico. People heard all of these warnings and they didn't care, or it didn't matter to them. And I think that was maybe the miscalculation, that people thought that those types of arguments were resonating with people. They clearly didn't with Brexit, and they clearly didn't here. And perhaps people don't feel, either they don't believe the warnings, or they don't feel that they will be personally touched by such events, by markets cratering, by a loss of stability and international governance. For some reason, that didn't resonate with people, and I think that in the coming weeks is what people will be analyzing.
Yeah, we've got. Let me just ask the producer: can we pull it up the electoral map? Let's do that and just take a look at that right now and see what we're looking at right now. I mean, we're still. Well, let's go through your scenario again.
Pennsylvania.
So Pennsylvania, we're still we can't call.
Wisconsin.
In Wisconsin.
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire,
In Michigan.
and Michigan. And Michigan, Wisconsin, and New Hampshire both are tending red. So she's not going to win this issue. It's not going to.
That's certainly what the betting markets now are saying, and the fact that we're watching people in the stock markets making all sorts of bets themselves on where they think the United States economy is going to go with the tremendous amount of uncertainty introduced in macroeconomic policy by a Donald Trump administration. I think the markets are speaking pretty clearly.
Is that something that can come back and bite a Trump presidency in the face? I mean, because he's said he's the businessman, but this is the first Republican presidential candidate we've had that's actually been feared by equities markets.
I think with a lot of his voters, no. I think that's what we saw with Brexit also. When the market tanked after Brexit, people voted for Brexit. There were some misleading news articles at the time which were saying people were immediately changing their vote, and actually that turned out to not really be so true. I think the markets are going to have a wild ride over the coming days. I'm not sure if that will change the opinion of most of his voters.
I also don't want to underplay the role of race. One of the tables that I saw showed how in the whitest of counties in the United States, how the votes have been going. And there's been a large shift towards the Republican vote in the whitest of counties in the United States. So there is something about the white identity politics that we're surprised that white people would act like a minority group, even though they're a large part of the population, is something that I think most people thought, no, there are good whites and bad whites, whatever, but that you would get that many people coalescing in this sort of, joining this sort of coalition is a surprise.
And if that is the case, then what you have is a singular roar by a group that in the past would not have been considered acceptable. I mean,
a lot of things have become speakable.
Well, but that also speaks to the fact of what Trump has been saying the entire campaign.
The prejudice that dare not speak its name, racism, suddenly ways of talking simply. We know which neighborhoods we're talking about. No longer a dog whistle, very explicit trumpet sounds.
And how much is it of it is it racism though? How much of it is maybe under or non-educated, low-skilled workers who feel like they have been left out by globalization, you name it?
So I think there's a certain degree of that, but it doesn't explain all of it. So I mean, certainly when you look at the Rust Belt areas, when you look at the Piedmont areas, when you look at the middle of the country that face some of these economic trends, that obviously has impacted this campaign.
Yeah.
But if you look at a lot of the southern states, for example, take Texas. Texas survived the economic recession fairly well. Texas has not necessarily had the same hollowing out of a manufacturing sector. Overall, unemployment has stayed low. But Texas went reliably for Trump. And it went reliably for Trump for a lot of reasons, one of which being that the state generally goes reliably Republican. Also because there are a lot of evangelical voters. But I think also because there are a lot of white middle-class voters who look at the rest of the country, who look at Ohio, for instance, and say, I don't want to become what Ohio is. I want to keep what's mine. And I think for a lot of people, a vote for Trump is a vote for, in a way, keeping what's theirs or a kind of status quo, even though his sort of mantra is make America great again, which implies some kind of change. I think for a lot of people that sit in the white middle class, this is keep me where I am right now.
An emergency brake. Does it fly in the face of the narrative of America wanting immigrants to come and to become part of society?
Yeah, I think, and a lot of people a lot of minorities in the United States and immigrants will interpret this as my neighbors don't like me. Again, not to keep going back to the Brexit example, but we saw the same reaction from non-white British people in the UK, that feeling of whether or not they personally were harassed or personally felt any animosity. the feeling was this vote shows that the white people I know secretly have something very strongly against me. And that's going to contribute to a huge feeling of unease.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, is there something cathartic in all of this that could be channeled into something good, or is it, as we said, these unspeakables that are being allowed to, have a volume now that has been forbidden in the past?
Maybe what we're also going to see is sort of an Act Two Republican Party versus Trump. The Republican Party leadership did not gladly accept Donald Trump, and Donald Trump as president might just end up clashing. Maybe we're going to see the checks and balances in a way that we're not expecting. Though I have to say, I can imagine very quickly the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, getting repealed.
Yes.
And I can imagine setting up the Supreme Court with very strict ideology requirements for the next appointments for the Supreme Court. That's where there's certainly going to be a common denominator, but maybe in the business of politics, the Republican Party will find itself forced to block bad ideas.
What about Obamacare? I mean, that is the one thing that we have heard time and time again. People complain about, but at the same time admit that they are now insured, and they can't be denied if they have pre-existing conditions. That's no longer allowed. I mean, it was definitely progress. Do you think Americans are going to allow that to be taken away from them?
I think there's a question over whether the gestures to repeal Obamacare were just an empty threat. They knew they would receive a veto. Now that it's actually possible to repeal, at this stage it may be far too complicated to repeal, and Republicans may know that if they throw a lot of people off of their health care, it's not like it's going to be immediately replaced with something better.
Well, that's the point, right? I mean, you didn't get Obamacare overnight. So how can you replace it overnight?
Well, in the realities of governing, I mean, this probably applies to a lot more things than Obamacare. A lot of the things that Trump promised on the campaign trail are blatantly undeliverable.
Right.
And so that will be interesting to watch as well amongst his supporters, the people who voted for him, when he inevitably can't deliver on all of these things. What happens then? What happens to his relationship with the Republican Party? What happens to his approval levels? That will be very interesting to watch.
I think the question on Obamacare as well kind of gets at one of the Republican mantras, which is, of course, always, roll back entitlements, things like this.
Right.
But what normally becomes the case is when you have an entitlement, something like Medicare or Medicaid program, once it's actually implemented, once people receive these benefits, they may say in theory that they prefer not to have the government provide them or the government not be responsible, but once they receive them, they actually quite like them.
Wait, it was that way with Medicare, Medicaid. Those things do not get repealed.
And I think you might see that same situation with Obamacare. The complication, the fact that people have health care. But I think similarly, the question is going to be how Trump does go about delivering on his campaign promises. And we, of course, saw a lot of executive orders in the Obama administration, which could have set a precedent for the way that Trump might go about achieving his aims.
Let's take a closer look now at what exactly has been happening with our panel of experts here. Irwin Collier from the JFK Institute, Dave Keating, and Ellen Schulz with us as well. I want to talk about, before the election, we talked a lot about a broad path to victory for Hillary Clinton and a narrow path for Donald Trump. Now the inverse has happened. Irwin, maybe you can bring us up to date. What exactly needs to happen for Hillary Clinton to still possibly have a chance here?
Okay, so we start with how narrower her path has become. She literally needs to win Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, and Michigan, where Wisconsin looks like that's the weakest of the group, but Michigan is also by no means certain, and Pennsylvania is weak as well. Earlier, we thought, well, Donald Trump has to run the table on the toss-up states. He ran the table on the toss-up states, and now it's Hillary's to lose. There are even calculations I've seen where it's quite plausible that this could end up at 269 to 269 tie, and then we have the spectacle of so-called faithless electors who just do not vote the way they're supposed to vote. They get fined $1,000 or something, but this could be a very, very odd ending, even with a tie.
All right, so we were talking about battleground states here that Donald Trump has in the bag, and still a few left to go. But Dave, if I can come to you now, this was a battle where Donald Trump had to run the table, as Irwin said. How surprising is it that he did?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are by fairly narrow margins. Florida, less narrow than it was looking early on, certainly. But that was one of his paths to victory, that he managed to win all of these swing states, run the table with all the swing states. And we still don't know what's going to happen, but it's interesting that before the vote, we were talking about a narrow path to victory for Trump, and at this exact moment, we're talking about a narrow path to victory for Clinton.
Yeah, and Ellen, this is not exactly what we were expecting to be talking about this point in the morning.
Not at all. I think, indeed, the degree to which we're talking about not sort of how is the GOP going to cope with the election loss and sort of embarrassment that was Donald Trump. I think this was the conversation over the last few weeks. Will the establishment GOP sort of take back over the party? Will the party fracture? How will the party conduct outreach to voters that they realized during the 2012 autopsy report that they weren't reaching? And I think what we're seeing instead is that Trump has, in a certain way, redefined who the GOP voter is, at least for him. And I guess the question now is less the reform of the party, which still is an open question going forward, but how does the party unite under Trump if he actually pulls this victory off?
When you look at the polling data, the red states are red, the blue states are blue, but everything got shifted at several points to get it for Trump to win.
Yeah, Dave, I hear you agreeing to that. I mean, what polls can we trust at this point?
Well, I think it's not just polls. I think a lot has been said about the bubbles that we're all putting ourselves into in social media. But I know a big reaction I'm seeing on social media now is people, particularly in the Northeast, where I'm originally from, are just perplexed because they didn't know any Trump supporters. They didn't see anyone. They only saw on their social media feeds a day of huge enthusiasm, people going out voting for Hillary, and you could see how they would have the idea that everybody was voting for Hillary, but of course it's just everybody in their social media bubble. So I think maybe the polls, there'll be a lot of looking into why the polls were scientifically inaccurate, but also maybe why the polls were reinforcing people's previously held beliefs about how other people felt.
As we're talking, it looks like we're just looking at some pictures of Trump headquarters. Don't know if we're waiting for him to take the podium at any time, but we are looking at some live pictures there from New York. Dave, I want to ask you, we heard the word from Richard Walker, our correspondent, a little bit earlier, that even Trump supporters seem to be gobsmacked. I mean, are they even prepared for possibly taking the office if that's what's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure this was largely a protest vote, protest vote against elites, against institutions, and a lot of people didn't expect their vote to win. It has reminds one of the Brexit results.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Of course, that doesn't mean that they now regret their vote or something, but they just didn't think far ahead into like what actually happens if this succeeds. So now it's time for Trump to prove to them that he can deliver on the promises that he made.